In 1947, archaeologists working in the mountains near the Dead Sea discovered something that would change how we read the Bible forever. Inside a series of caves, they found ancient scrolls that had been hidden for nearly 2,000 years. Among the texts was a detailed account of beings called Nephilim, giants who walked the earth before the Great Flood. The scrolls describe them in terrifying detail, their height, their strength, their origins, and most importantly, what happened to them. But here is what made archaeologists stop and reconsider everything. The Dead Sea Scrolls were not the only place these giants appeared. Ancient burial mounds across America contained skeletons of people 7 to 10 feet tall. Chinese excavations unearthed graves with remains of individuals over 6 feet 3 inches when the average height was 5 feet. Peruvian caves held corpses so large it took multiple people to carry a single skeleton. These were not myths, these were documented discoveries made by credible institutions. Smithsonian records from the 1800s describe giant skeletons found in burial mounds east of the Mississippi River. Early American newspapers reported discoveries of bones belonging to people of extraordinary size. And then something strange happened. The skeletons disappeared. The records were suppressed, and mainstream archaeology stopped talking about them. But the Bible never stopped talking about the Nephilim. Genesis chapter 6 describes them clearly. Numbers chapter 13 records Israelite spies encountering them in Canaan. Deuteronomy names specific giant kings and measures their beds. These were not symbolic stories. These were historical accounts written by people who claim to have seen these beings with their own eyes. What you are about to discover is that evidence for biblical giants exists in archaeological records, ancient texts, and physical sites that can still be visited today. Some of this evidence has been hidden, some has been dismissed, but all of it points to the same unsettling conclusion. The Nephilim were real, and the Bible's description of them is more accurate than modern science wants to admit. The Nephilim first appear in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, in one of the most mysterious passages in the entire Bible. The text says that when human beings began to increase on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful and married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. This passage has generated thousands of years of debate. Who were the sons of God? Traditional Jewish and early Christian interpretation understood this phrase to mean fallen angels. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text written around 300 BCE and found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, expands this story dramatically. It names specific angels who descended to Mount Hermon, took human wives, and produced giant offspring. The Nephilim, according to Enoch, were not natural beings. They were hybrids, part divine, part human, and they grew to enormous size. The text describes them as 300 cubits tall in some passages, though scholars debate whether this is literal or symbolic. What is not debatable is that ancient Jewish writers believed these beings were real physical giants who lived before the flood. The Genesis account places the Nephilim immediately before the story of Noah. This is not coincidental. Many biblical scholars believe the Nephilim were one of the primary reasons God sent the flood. Genesis chapter 6 verse 5 says that the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth. The Nephilim represented a corruption of humanity itself. They were beings that should not have existed, and their presence on earth was viewed as an abomination. The flood was meant to wipe them out completely. but it did not succeed. Numbers chapter 13 makes this clear. Hundreds of years after the flood, Moses sends 12 spies to scout the promised land of Canaan. They return with a terrifying report. "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." This passage confirms that Nephilim survived the flood, or that fallen angels produced more giants after the flood. Either way, the Israelites were confronting enormous beings who terrified trained warriors. Goliath is the most famous giant in the Bible, and archaeological discoveries have confirmed details about him that seemed impossible just decades ago. 1 Samuel chapter 17 describes Goliath as a Philistine warrior from Gath who stood 6 cubits and a span tall. A cubit is roughly 18 inches. A span is about 9 inches. That makes Goliath approximately 9 feet 9 inches tall. For years, skeptics claimed this was obvious exaggeration. No human could be that tall. Then archaeologists began finding evidence. In 2005, researchers excavating the ancient Philistine city of Gath discovered pottery shards with inscriptions. One piece contained 2 names written in Proto-Canaanite script, Alwat and WLT. These are non-Semitic names, linguistically related to the name Goliath. The discovery does not prove Goliath existed, but it proves the name was used in Gath during the correct historical period, making the biblical account more plausible. Even more interesting is what archaeology reveals about Philistine culture. The Philistines were not native to Canaan. They migrated from the Aegean region, probably from areas around Greece or Crete. Skeletal remains from Philistine cemeteries show they were taller on average than the local Canaanite population. Some individuals stood well over 6 feet, which was enormous for the ancient world when average male height was 5 feet 5 inches. The biblical description of Goliath's armor also matches archaeological findings. 1 Samuel says he wore a bronze helmet and bronze scale armor weighing 5,000 shekels, roughly 125 pounds. Archaeologists have found that Philistine warriors did indeed use bronze scale armor, unlike the Israelites who primarily used leather. Goliath was not an isolated case. 2 Samuel chapter 20 describes 4 other giant warriors from Gath who fought for the Philistines. One named Ishbi-Benob had a bronze spearhead weighing 300 shekels. Another named Saph was also from the race of giants. A third warrior had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in total. The Bible records that David's men killed all of them. These were not mythological monsters. These were real warriors from a specific city with specific physical characteristics that multiple biblical authors recorded independently. Og, king of Bashan, is described in Deuteronomy as the last of the Rephaim, a race of giants who lived east of the Jordan River. Deuteronomy chapter 3 verse 11 provides a specific detail that archaeologists have used to estimate his size. His bed was made of iron and was more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. 9 cubits equals approximately 13.5 feet. 4 cubits equals 6 feet. Even accounting for ancient beds being larger than the person sleeping in them, Og must have been somewhere between 11 and 13 feet tall. The text says this bed could still be seen in Rabbah of the Ammonites, suggesting it was preserved as a curiosity or trophy. Some scholars argue the bed reference is symbolic, meant to represent Og's power rather than literal size. But ancient Jewish historians like Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, took it literally. Josephus claims Og was so tall that when he sat down, his feet reached the ground while normal men could walk under his legs. Whether Josephus had access to sources we no longer have or was embellishing, his account shows that ancient writers believed Og was a real person of extraordinary size. The Rephaim were not limited to Og. Genesis chapter 14 mentions them as inhabiting the land before Abraham arrived. Deuteronomy chapter 2 says they were considered giants like the Anakim. They lived in the region later occupied by the Ammonites and Moabites, and local people called them Zamzamim and Amim, names that may have meant terrible ones or fearful ones. Archaeological excavations in the Golan Heights have uncovered a mysterious site called Gilgal Rephaim, which translates to Wheel of the Giants. From ground level, it looks like random piles of rocks. From above, it reveals itself as 5 concentric stone circles, with the outer ring over 500 feet in diameter. At the center is a burial chamber carved into solid rock, covered by a mound of stones over 16 feet tall. The site dates to the Bronze Age, roughly 3000 to 2000 BCE, the same period when the Bible says giants lived in the region. No one knows who built it or why. Local tradition attributes it to the Rephaim. Whether that is accurate or not, it demonstrates that something unusual was happening in that area during the biblical time period. The Anakim were a specific tribe of giants that terrified the Israelite spies Moses sent into Canaan. Numbers chapter 13 verse 28 records their report. The people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Anakim lived in Hebron, a city that still exists today in the West Bank. Archaeological excavations at Hebron have revealed massive stone walls and fortifications that date to the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 2000 to 1500 BCE. The stones used in these walls are enormous, some weighing several tons. Modern builders struggle to explain how ancient people moved and placed these massive blocks without advanced machinery. If the builders were significantly larger and stronger than average humans, the construction becomes more plausible. The Bible names 3 Anakim brothers who lived in Hebron: Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai. Joshua chapter 15 verse 14 says Caleb drove them out when the Israelites finally conquered the land. But before that, their presence was so intimidating that 10 of the 12 spies convinced the entire Israelite nation to refuse to enter Canaan. Only Joshua and Caleb had faith that God would help them defeat the giants. The Anakim were eventually destroyed or driven out, but their reputation lasted for centuries. Deuteronomy chapter 9 verse 2 describes them in language meant to evoke terror. The people are strong and tall Anakites. You know about them and have heard it said, "Who can stand up against the Anakites?" This was not mythology to the Israelites. This was recent history involving real people who were genuinely terrified of encountering beings much larger and stronger than themselves. In 2017, archaeologists working in China discovered a cemetery in Jiaojia village containing over 200 graves dating back 5,000 years. The skeletal remains showed something remarkable. The men buried there averaged over 6 feet tall, with some individuals reaching 6 feet 3 inches or more. This might not sound unusual today, but 5,000 years ago, when the average Chinese male stood around 5 feet 4 inches, these individuals were giants. What made the discovery even more interesting was that the tallest skeletons were found in the largest tombs with the most grave goods, suggesting these individuals held high social status. Scientists examining the remains concluded that these people had access to better nutrition, which allowed them to grow taller. But the size difference is so dramatic that it suggests something more than just good food. Some researchers have proposed that this cemetery represents a distinct population, possibly descendants of people groups that migrated from other regions and interbred with local populations. The timing is significant. 5,000 years ago puts these burials in the same general period as the biblical Nephilim, and the time shortly after the Great Flood, according to biblical chronology. The Bible says Nephilim existed both before and after the flood. If some survived, or if the phenomenon that produced them occurred again after the flood, we would expect to find pockets of unusually tall people in various regions around the world in the post-flood period. China is not alone. Similar discoveries have been made in other locations. In Nevada, Lovelock Cave contained the mummified remains of individuals reported to be between 6 and 8 feet tall. Paiute Native American legends describe a race of red-haired giants called the Sai-Ti-Ka, who lived in the area and were eventually driven into the cave and killed. The mummies and artifacts found in the cave suggest the legends may be based on real events. In the Ohio River Valley, thousands of burial mounds contain skeletons of people larger than average. 19th century excavation reports describe finds of bones from individuals 7 feet tall or more. The Smithsonian Institution received many of these skeletons, but most have disappeared from their collections with no explanation for where they went or why they are no longer available for study. Peru presents some of the most compelling physical evidence for ancient giants. In the 1500s, Spanish conquistadors encountered local legends about a race of giants who had lived along the coast before being destroyed. A Spanish priest named Reginaldo de Lizárraga wrote about entering a cave and finding 3 gigantic corpses. Each skeleton was so large that it required multiple men to move it. The bones eventually disappeared, but the account was documented in multiple Spanish colonial records. In more recent times, elongated skulls found in Peru have reignited debate about unusual human populations in the ancient world. While mainstream archaeology attributes these to cranial deformation practices, some researchers point out that many of the skulls are not just deformed, but larger in volume than normal human skulls, suggesting the individuals may have been naturally larger overall. Whether these skulls are related to biblical giants is speculative, but they demonstrate that unusual human remains exist in the archaeological record, and that local legends often preserve memories of people groups that were notably different from the current population. The Smithsonian controversy is one of the most persistent aspects of the giant skeleton debate. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, American newspapers regularly published accounts of giant skeletons being discovered in Native American burial mounds. Reports came from Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Tennessee, and many other states. The descriptions were specific. Skeletons 7 to 9 feet tall, double rows of teeth, 6 fingers and 6 toes, massive jaw bones and thick skulls. Most of these skeletons were reportedly sent to the Smithsonian Institution for further study, and then they vanished. The Smithsonian officially denies having any such specimens and claims the newspaper reports were hoaxes or misidentifications of normal human remains. However, researchers have found documents suggesting the Smithsonian did receive unusual skeletal material in the 1800s, but later disposed of it or lost track of it in storage. In 1894, the Smithsonian's own annual report mentioned the discovery of prehistoric mounds in Ohio containing skeletons of unusually large size. Other institutional records acknowledge receiving remains from mound excavations, but provide no details about what happened to them. Critics argue this represents a systematic suppression of evidence that contradicts mainstream evolutionary timelines. Defenders argue it represents poor record-keeping and the loss of specimens over more than a century of institutional changes. Either way, the practical result is that skeletal evidence that could settle the question of whether giant humans existed in ancient America is not available for modern scientific testing. This has allowed the debate to continue without resolution for over 100 years. The Book of Enoch, though not included in most modern Bibles, was considered scripture by early Christians and is still part of the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible. The Dead Sea Scrolls included multiple copies of Enoch, proving it was widely read in ancient Judaism. Enoch expands the Genesis 6 account dramatically. It names the 200 angels who descended to Mount Hermon, led by one called Semjaza. It describes how they swore an oath together to take human wives, knowing this violated divine law. It details how the Nephilim were born from these unions and grew to enormous size. But more disturbing, Enoch describes what the Nephilim did. They consumed all the resources humans had produced. Then they turned on humanity and began eating people. The violence and corruption they caused became so severe that the earth itself cried out to heaven for help. According to Enoch, God decided to destroy the Nephilim and their fathers through the flood, and he sent archangels to bind the fallen angels in darkness until the final judgment. The relevance of Enoch to archaeology is this. The book was written between 300 and 100 BCE, preserving traditions that may go back much further. The fact that it was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls proves that ancient Jewish communities took it seriously, and the level of specific detail about the Nephilim suggests the writers believed they were preserving real history, not writing fiction. Whether that history is accurate is debatable, but it shows that belief in literal giants was mainstream in ancient Judaism and early Christianity, not a fringe interpretation. Mount Hermon sits on the border between Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. It is the location where Enoch says the fallen angels descended. Interestingly, ancient structures do exist on and around Mount Hermon that remain unexplained. The mountain contains numerous megalithic circles, walls, and enclosures built with massive stones. Some of these structures date back thousands of years, though precise dating is difficult. Local tradition has always associated Mount Hermon with spiritual significance and strange events. In ancient times, it was a center of pagan worship. Temples to various gods were built on its slopes. The Greeks called it the Mountain of the Oath, which strangely matches the Enochian account of angels swearing an oath there. The Gilgal-Rephaim site mentioned earlier is located near Mount Hermon, in the Golan Heights. These connections between location, ancient structures, and biblical accounts do not prove the Nephilim existed, but they show that the biblical writers were describing real geographic locations where unusual things were happening, and where later generations continued to report unusual findings and local legends about giants. The ultimate question is not whether unusually tall people existed in the ancient world. Modern medicine knows that giantism is a real medical condition caused by hormone imbalances. The question is whether the Bible's specific claims about Nephilim are accurate. Did beings exist who were 9 to 15 feet tall? Were they the offspring of fallen angels and human women? Did God send the flood partly to destroy them? Did they reappear after the flood? The archaeological evidence shows that legends of giants are universal across human cultures. The Bible's accounts match details found in other ancient texts from Mesopotamia, Greece, and elsewhere. Skeletal remains of people significantly taller than average have been found in multiple locations around the world. Ancient structures exist that seem to require builders of unusual strength. 19th century institutional records acknowledge finding unusual human remains that have since disappeared. None of this constitutes absolute proof, but it creates a pattern that is difficult to dismiss entirely. The Bible never claimed the Nephilim were symbolic. It described them as real beings who lived in specific places, fought specific battles, and were eventually destroyed. Either the biblical authors were recording actual history as they understood it, or they were creating elaborate fictions that happened to correlate with archaeological anomalies around the world. The choice of which interpretation to accept depends heavily on one's prior assumptions about whether the supernatural is possible. But what is increasingly clear is that dismissing the Nephilim accounts as pure mythology requires ignoring a significant amount of evidence that suggests something unusual was happening in the ancient world. Giants walked the earth. The Bible recorded it, and the evidence, though suppressed and scattered, still exists for those willing to look.